Hi everyone, this is the Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich 1921 Diary Series. I'm William Lee and I have a PhD in Russian history from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, which is part of University College, the University of London. So I thought I've been doing these for quite a while now without having mentioned that. Under the silly assumption that everybody's been watching from episode 1. So I thought I'd better bring that up again so that you'll know what my credentials are. And we're going through the diaries of Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich. So we have a recap from yesterday's video, which was focused on the diary entry of the 1st of March, 1921. This is the 2nd, of course. It's a Wednesday in Berlin. Dmitri's staying at the Hotel Excelsior. He does not give us his room number today, although you may remember from yesterday that it was room 102, which the whole hotel has ceased to exist. Okay, so the recap: he left Copenhagen in the morning at 9:30 in the morning. He arrived in Berlin at 9:30 at night, and he traveled with a friend, Audrey Parr, and with an old acquaintance, almost a member of the family, who'd been a part of Grand Duke Sergei and Grand Duchess Ella's household, old Countess Olsufieva. Okay, so his reception at the station was on a grand scale with lots of people, and that prompted in him a kind of almost paranoid fear that he was being set up, that it was a trap of some kind to cause him to lose his credibility and his dignity. But that didn't turn out to be the case. He had lost his wallet and his picture of Gugi, of Marie-Louise, back in Denmark, and so he went to bed depressed. So that's where we left him. And for our cast of characters today, we do have one new person, and that person was Dmitri's old flame in Russia before the revolution, in wartime Russia, and her name was Vera Karalli. Okay, here we go. Galeevsky came to me first thing in the morning, looking very official, which I could not observe without laughing. Then old Rausch turned up. He's a touching and devoted fellow. I walked to the Adlon for lunch, and Galeevsky came along with me. He was in a panic over my security in view of the fact that there are Bolsheviks living freely in Berlin. I lunched with Audrey Parr, who left for Paris that day. Then I took a walk with her, and she very touchingly presented me with a new wallet. I got home around 4 o'clock, and at 5 o'clock went with Galeevsky to the Russian General Assembly. That visit stirred up all kinds of noise in the Russian newspapers. A solemn reception ensued, such that there could no longer be any pretense of calling it a casual or private visit. The representatives of various organizations read me welcoming speeches, but fortunately did not bring up the extremely painful matter of succession to the throne, and treated me as a representative of the House of Romanov. I had made that an absolute condition of my attendance there. I said a few words to them in reply, thanked them on behalf of the entire family, and expressed confidence that the hour would come when the legitimate Russian emperor would mount the Russian throne and bring peace to Russia. After the greetings, tea was served, and there was general conversation. I got home around 7 o'clock and went out to dinner with Vera, who has now settled in Berlin and is acting in a movie. She was very touching and sweet. Dinner was very nice. She accompanied me back to the hotel. Then I wrote letters to Gugi, of course, and Lucia, whom I thanked for the visit to Copenhagen. Okay, I know what movie Vera was making. It would be her last movie, but I can't remember the title, so I'll include that along with the description of this video on YouTube. Okay, who was Vera Karalli? Vera Alexeyevna Karalli. Well, she was a little older than Dmitri, just marginally. I think she was 31 or 32 at this time, and he was 29 and would be turning 30. She first met him, it was kind of an arranged thing. One of his women friends, if I recall correctly, I should have looked all of this up before, but I'm kind of doing this on the fly. Did I say that? Anyway, I mean this particular video, not the videos in general. Anyway, some female friend had been looking for the perfect mistress for him and had settled on Karalli and arranged a meeting. And it was funny. It was almost kind of like the setup with Marie-Louise when Dmitri was told that he should go up to her room, and then she was really embarrassed. And there was a similar thing with Karalli where he was taken up to her room, and it wasn't the way she'd wanted him to meet her for the first time. She was spending the night with this friend of his. But anyway, they hit it off. They hit it off. They had a good time together. Okay, that sounds smarmy, but that's not what I meant. In general, they liked each other and would remain friends. And Dmitri was pretty good at that. To be honest, he did not have antagonistic relationships with women after breakups. He tended to keep them as friends, and they kept him as a friend. And so that's a nice aspect of his life. So, according to him in his diaries, interestingly, Vera was the one who had straightened him out at some point, who had helped him to be less of a sort of wild boy, playboy. And I should have looked that up as well, because that's in the diaries that he talks about that. And he also credits her with having helped him to calm down after the Rasputin assassination. So it's been said that she accompanied him to the Yusupov Palace on the night of the assassination, but that's not the way he presents it. He presents it that she was actually waiting for him, obviously in the know, but waiting for him at his palace in Petrograd, and she was there when he got home, and he was in a very distressed state. He was really distraught. He talks about that. And she and Laming sat up with him all night and managed to calm him down. So if you're looking at Dmitri's diaries yourself, you will find that description on page 207 of book 16. And yeah, she was, when he was expelled from Russia then and made his way to Tehran, she was writing to him, and she was intimating that she was ready to come and join him in Tehran, and he just didn't want that. He didn't want that, and so he talks about that in the diaries as well. But they met up again in 1919. They had a reunion in London, and they decided that they would, they had a reunion in London. I don't want to put it rudely, but yeah, they did resume their physical relationship in London, but ultimately they decided that they were not going to continue on as lovers. And she was continuing to make movies. She was a ballerina, but around 1914, she was able to break into film as well. And so she would divide her career between those two things. And, she was not someone that Dmitri was writing to by the time he was at Schatzhelp. So, it's possible that they stopped when he got married or something like that, although he did have other women friends that he continued to be in touch with at Schatzalp, for instance, Giselle Marburg, who he'd also met well, he hadn't met Karalli in London. But anyway, he'd met Giselle in London in 1919, and yet he was still writing to her in 1939, 1940. But anyway, I guess she and Dmitri had both moved on with their lives. She would move to Vienna around 1942, or so around the time Dmitri died. And, it's possible that they were in touch and he just didn't jot it down in his diaries. But anyway, she would move to Vienna and teach dance. And if any of you happen to be in London and you're at all curious, I can tell you from Dmitri's diary what her address was in London. It was 76 Elm Park Gardens, Kensington. So go knock on the door and ask the people currently living there if they know anything about Grand Duke Dmitri and Vera Karalli. Okay, so going to the diary entry itself, there's a mention here of the very famous Adlon Hotel, probably more famous, undoubtedly more famous than the Excelsior. And I've heard it said that the Adlon was actually the hotel that the movie Grand Hotel was based on. The famous movie was Greta Garbo. But I've also heard that it was the Excelsior, so I'm not quite sure. But anyway, that's where Dmitri goes for lunch, which is interesting, although he's not staying there. He is meeting there with Audrey Parr. And so Golevsky accompanies him to the hotel, but then doesn't join him and Audrey Parr, obviously. And why Golevsky insists on accompanying him is because Golevsky is terrified that there's going to be a kidnapping or assassination attempt or something like that on the part of the Bolsheviks who are living freely in Berlin, as Dmitri puts it. Dmitri is obviously not concerned about that. Dmitri had, at other times in his life, been a target or believed himself to be a target after Grand Duke Sergei's assassination. And in the course of that plot, Dmitri and Maria themselves had almost been killed. But after Sergei's assassination, you may recall, if you've been watching these all along, that as a boy of 14, Dmitri was very ill at ease being in Moscow and even going to public places like out to the theater, and he was having a hard time wrapping his head around the idea that there were people in the world who could possibly want to kill him. So that was a source of some anxiety, and then he was able to overcome that by the time he was 16 years old. That was old news, and he would happily take walks out on the streets in Moscow. But then later, after the Rasputin assassination, there were also death threats, and he was worried, or he saw it as a possibility that people wanted to kill him again. And then, there would be things that the Soviets would do. They would kidnap white Russian individuals off the streets who were of importance. I can't remember exactly who it was who was famously just dragged off the streets into a black car and then turned up in Moscow in a sort of show trial and was executed. But this happened, and there were assassinations, although the assassinations that would be going on in Berlin soon in 1923, the assassination would be of an attempted assassination of Paul Milyukov, in which Vladimir Nabokov would die. We've already talked about that. So it was on the other side of the political spectrum that assassinations were occurring with respect to the Russian emigre community. So, at this point, Dmitri wasn't concerned with it. I know that in the late 30s, I know from the biography of Kazembek that he did have a bodyguard. I don't know, I'll have to reread that book. I'm not sure it's clear why And later at Schatzalp, there would be, after his death, there would be a rumor that circulated that he was murdered, and nobody ever stipulated who would have done that. It was a very vague rumor. It was spread by a certain Russian doctor, medical doctor, who was in Davos after the war, made a visit to Davos and talked to Gustav Maurer, the head doctor at Schatzalp, where Dmitri had been a patient, and then wrote this book and said that Maurer had told him that Dmitri had been murdered, and I think the whole thing is very, very unlikely. Very unlikely that Maurer had told him that. I can't imagine, and even more unlikely that Dmitri was murdered. I mean, if we entertain the notion even for a second, I would say that the culprit would not be the Nazis or the Soviets, even though Dmitri had antagonized them both, but would be a right-wing Russian fanatic of some kind. Anyway, there's really no use speculating about that because he was not murdered. That was just a rumor. Okay, so the Russian General Assembly was this group led by Rimsky-Korsakov, whom we talked about yesterday, who was a far-right member of the Imperial Russian government, the governor of Yaroslavl, a senator, and so on and so forth. And he'd, joined the club. He'd founded one of these groups when he was in exile in Germany. It seemed like everybody was founding their own groups. It was called the Russian General Assembly, and they invited Dmitri to tea, clearly. So he refers to that, and he refers to the Russian newspaper. So the fact that he attended this tea led to all this talk in the Russian newspapers. Well, there were Russian newspapers by then all over Europe. Everywhere there was an emigre community, there was a Russian newspaper. And I know, as I've mentioned before, that the Russian newspapers in Paris and London, the more liberal ones, the more moderate ones, not even necessarily liberal, were going to absolutely rip Dmitri apart when he got back to Paris. I don't know, he doesn't tell us what was being said in the German Russian newspapers, but I'm sure it was more favorable. Okay, so it's interesting that once again he reiterates that he is determined not to be seen as the pretender to the throne. And as you know, he is thinking of himself as the sort of forerunner, not the forerunner, but the front runner, as pretender to the throne, but he doesn't want this to be something that is talked about or that is a public position. So apparently he made the stipulation that he would only visit the Russian National Assembly if they did not introduce him that way. But what's really interesting is that in his brief speech, he refers to his confidence in the fact that there would, in due course, be another emperor of Russia. And this is the first time in all his talk about him being a candidate for the throne, he never refers to himself as a future emperor, only as a future Tsar or a future ruler or leader, but never as an emperor. And it's not surprising that in this instance he used that word, because these monarchists in Berlin were mostly in favor of autocracy, and they wanted the Russian Empire to be restored, and they wanted the autocracy to be restored. And so they would have expected that of him, to refer to an emperor and not just a Tsar. But what's even more interesting than that is the messianic element that comes into it. And I don't think that's something that was necessarily, I'm sure it was a feature of the right-wing Russian element in Berlin, but I think it was something that was there for a lot of Russians, whatever their political persuasion, and certainly for Dmitri, this messianic element. It's so clear, but because when he talks about what this future emperor is going to bring to Russia, he says that he will bring peace. He doesn't say prosperity, prestige, might, a great power status. He says peace. Well, what is peace when you're not even actually at war? It's something more spiritual and transcendent. So like a Messiah, this future emperor will bring peace to Russia. Okay, finally we find out that on his very not the first day, but when he arrived late at night, but on his second day in Berlin, even though it's a very busy day, he sits down and writes a letter to dear Gugi, even though he's seen 2 other women during the course of the day. He had lunch with Audrey, and then he had dinner with Vera. But he writes to Gugi, I arrived safely, dear, so on and so forth. Anyway, then he thanks Lucia for the trip to Copenhagen. And what does he mean by that? It could be that he's just saying that he thanks her for her hospitality. They put him up the whole 2 weeks he was there and arranged parties for him. And on the other hand, it could be that he is indeed thanking her for the trip, and that she was indeed she and Sir Charles were the ones that paid for it. They'd provided Dmitri with financial assistance in the past and helped him out. And it's possible that that was what made the trip to Copenhagen possible. Anyway, I will leave it there. We will be seeing more of Vera. I should have looked specifically at the next diary entry. Let me scan it real quick. What do we have? The meeting with Biskupski, other important meetings. One with a member of the German government. And then, yes, meeting with Markov. Yes, and Vera Karalli will be back. Okay, on my screen, I'm looking at all these, there's sunlight coming in through the window and all these lines of sunlight, and I don't know if that will be on the video, but if it is, apologies for that, and yeah, hope to see you next time. Bye.